Number 10 is Foe. Now, this pick might seem rather obvious at first because they're the mascot of the game. Foe is a cute creature who has been with us since part 1, but who we know was actually at one point a beast, Cathpalooc. This is something that was hinted rather often during Arc 1, such as their independent manifestation shown in Fuyuki, lines from Merlin or Ereshkigal during Babylon, and of course the reveal within the finale itself. However, while we know about Cathpalooc and we've followed Foe, we've never gotten the beast form itself within the game. Foe is a unit that makes sense, because they'd be known by every player. They're the first thing you see even before directly meeting the protagonist, Ritsuka. They have a role that is noticeable, and are tied to characters people love, such as Mash, Ritsuka, Merlin, and even Artoria to a certain extent. We've even gotten a few details about them in Garden of Avalon, which implies a deep connection to Merlin that hasn't quite been explored within FGO. Foe is a unit that by all means would perform well, and who makes sense due to their role within the story. But that's about all I can say. Something that's important to think about when it comes to a list like this is the role the unit can have in an upcoming story chapter, a trend that has existed with anniversary servants from the beginning, and what their kit could look like. Foe within the story has already given up their role as a beast. While there's been scattered hints they might be gaining it back, such as the beginning of Ordeal Call 4, there's nothing truly definitive, but the real question to ask is whether Foe becoming a beast again would have value, and if that value specifically applies to them becoming a servant. Now, it's not impossible to have a beast class servant, as we have Nero Draco and Anki Ereshkigal, nor is it impossible to have a servant that's an animal, such as Hessian Lobo. However, there's something to be asked about whether it is necessary. What role can Foe play in the upcoming story that requires them to be a beast again, let alone a servant? And even if there is one, doesn't that risk undermining their sacrifice at the end of the first arc, where they gave up that power to make Mash human? Another thing worth acknowledging is their kit, which would likely be one of two things: full offensive, given their nature as Cathpalooc, or a hybrid support, due to their connection to Merlin. But neither a pure offensive unit or a unit like Merlin are necessarily unique. Now, there's not an inherent condition that the Annie servant must have a unique kit, but it's still something worth looking out for. In addition to this, what would their class be? I'd assume Beast initially, but we actually have a quote from Nasu, the main writer of FGO, where they talk about how no other servants will become Beast class within proper human history. Now, we've seen this loophole in action with Anki Ereshkigal, and almost certainly will in the future, but Foe is a beast that has been tied almost exclusively to proper human history, making them seem unlikely. Foe is far from impossible, but currently I'm not convinced they're very likely, hence them being in the number 10 spot. Coming in at number 9 is Galahad. This one might come as a surprise to some players, especially those who recently read Ordeal Call 4. However, despite Galahad's popularity, their recent role, and their seemingly unique kit options, I think Galahad is not a very likely anniversary servant. Galahad is one of the most obvious full circle units possible, due to their role within Arc 1 as the servant who was summoned into MASH during the demi-servant experiments. However, despite this, Galahad did not show up in Arc 1, and a lot of their role has been shrouded in mystery. Supposedly, they disappeared during the conclusion of Arc 1 during the Temple of Time, likely when Mash died, but we don't necessarily know the real reason why, nor have they had much of a role since. Galahad fundamentally is a character who was always going to be seen as an extension of Mash within Grand Order. While they have roles in other properties like Fate/Requiem, or are just generally popular due to being a Knight of the Round, their connection to Mash within Grand Order is not something that can be overlooked within Grand Order itself. Galahad recently appeared in Ordeal Call 4, which could have been a source of answers, or a necessary conclusion to their dynamic with Mash, but this final confrontation seemingly fell short on most of those things. This is one of the reasons I struggle to believe Galahad could be Anniversary, despite recognizing that they make sense, because they just appeared. What value is there to having Galahad in Ordeal Call 4 as a minor cameo antagonist role if you're gonna just do them again in Finale? Ordeal Call 4 itself did not necessarily set up a return, it just left room for one. But does that potential return even justify their role within Ordeal Call 4, or did it make more sense to conclude them within that chapter? However, Narrative concerns aside, the biggest issue with Galahad by far is their kit. Galahad's kit can fall in one of two main directions: some kind of hybrid support or offensive kit, maybe based around counterattacks, or a full defensive support kit. This has value on paper, but it's Galahad's class that is the biggest concern. Shielder. This is a class that has neutral affinity, but the most important part is that we already have a free unit with that class. Mash. Mash is a character who has gotten multiple forms throughout the game, but always with the Shielder class. She has had no costs for the entire game, and within Ordeal Call 4, finally got a 5-star offensive form. But notably, Mash is a free unit, who will someday get NP5. This is the biggest issue with Galahad. For them to be worth pulling for, they must be able to perform equally at NP1 to a guaranteed NP5 Mash, or have a completely different direction that their kit takes. However, Mash has already had both a very defensive kit and a newly offensive one, leaving little room for Galahad. This potentially opens up a third option for their kit, where they become a support meant specifically for Mash. This could be worthwhile because every single player has Mash, and will guarantee NP5 by the end of the story. But is a character specifically meant for one character even worth pulling for, even if everyone has that character? It's no secret that the story forces you to use Mash often, but is it actually worth it to pull for a character whose main thing might only be supporting that one character? They no doubt would have utility outside of it, but given Mash's 5-star form is specifically a form switch mechanic, the room for Galahad's potential support kit is rather limited. In addition, a hybrid offensive counterattack type kit is already something done by Bazette, and a full defensive kit would likely feel more like a robbery to Mash, who had a fully defensive kit in Ordeal Call 4, we just didn't get it. Because of how unlikely it seems that Galahad could effectively be worth running when you already have NP5 Mash, I don't think they make sense as an anniversary servant. Oh, we have to scroll up. Fuck. Alright. Coming in at number 8 is Monaka. This might come as a surprise given that Monaka is not a character native to Grand Order. However, we've had anniversary servants in the past who are not, that being Archetype Earth. Monaka is a character from Fate/Prototype Fragments, who has been teased within Grand Order for years, pretty much since the end of Arc 1. Within the Arthur trial quest, a plot thread was started where Arthur was shown to be hunting Beast 6, who is Monaka, which has not been concluded. We've occasionally had acknowledgements of this, such as within the interludes of Fate/Prototype characters, or appearances in events, such as Lellum Harlot, or even just FGO Arcade as a whole. But this plot thread has not been concluded, and it is likely it will be before the story concludes. Monaka on first glance is not a very logical anniversary candidate, but she does fulfill most criteria. The main things that I'm looking for when determining the most likely anniversary candidates are how full circle a character is, meaning how fulfilling they are to be in the spot, and how well they perform. While I've been acknowledging things like kits, that is mostly secondary, even if important. Monaka is full circle in a very different way to someone like Foe or Galahad. She isn't full circle for FGO, she's full circle for its writer, Nasu. Monaka is from a story that was never even really published, which was written long before Fate as we know it came about. Due to this, Monaka would make sense as an anniversary servant because she's a character who is fulfilling for the writer. Monaka also has a lot of implied roles within future chapters, and a very interesting dynamic with the main character of FGO, that being Ritsuka. Despite common portrayal, Monaka is a character who was born so close to their root that they are functionally inhuman. Their power is almost impossible to compare, which leads to a version of love that reads as apathy. Monaka doesn't necessarily mean harm, she just doesn't place the same value that most humans do. Within stories like Fate/Labyrinth, it's very clear that Monaka does like something that in a lot of ways acts as a mirror to Ritsuka. Ritsuka is a character who is criminally misunderstood, but who has consistently been defined as someone who loves and trusts unconditionally. There's constant comments within main story, events, interludes, even My Room dialogues that talk about how Ritsuka trusts everyone, whether it's to chastise her, praise her, or even just acknowledgement. Within Ordeal Call 2, this is even taken to the extreme, where Monte Cristo accounts for her getting killed by someone for trusting them, despite her knowing she shouldn't trust them and that they'd stab her in the back. This form of love, while being idealized, is functionally very inhuman, as she actively does not have a sense of self-preservation that triumphs her love towards others. Monaka isn't identical, but she is a foil. She's a character who's been stabbed in the back by the person she loved, and came out loving them more. She's someone whose dream isn't even for herself, but the person who literally killed her. But namely, Monaka is someone who represents the other side of the equation Ritsuka inhabits, when a foreign kind of love is seen as harm rather than something good. The reality is that Ritsuka has hurt countless people. She admits this directly within Ordeal Call 4, but has been actively aware and struggling with it since at least the Garden of Lostwell during Avalon Lefay. She directly acknowledges that Lostwell citizens are of equal value to proper human history, yet still fights for it, despite acknowledging within Lostwell that she doesn't even know why she does. It's very easy to idealize this, but it doesn't change the fact that Ritsuka is someone who has killed millions of people by erasing their worlds, and in Ordeal Call 4, it's even revealed that after the finale, those worlds won't even be remembered. Monaka in a sense represents the space that Ritsuka could take, something even explored to a certain extent within Ordeal Call 2, where love like that, especially combined with betrayal, something has been built to repeatedly, even deliberately called out within Ordeal Call 4 as the worst sin, could lead to Ritsuka becoming monstrous, like Monaka. That isn't because she will, but it poses a necessary foil to face to reach the conclusion the story has been building to. Monaka isn't the only one who fits the role, but she could. When we've heard about Beast 6, there's been one particular title attached, that being Beast of the Stars. It's no secret that one of the remaining conflicts is the Foreigner class, but specifically Outer Gods, alongside plenty of hints toward Void Cells, something consistently denoted by the Foreigner class. The framing of Monaka as the Beast of the Stars leaves room for her within a chapter focusing on that, especially if that chapter focuses on Ritsuka finding that conclusion she's been looking for since Lostwell, a reason to fight. Monaka on the surface might not have many kit options, but Beast class always leaves room for it, or even a class like Pretender or a kit like Merlin, given Monaka being compared to flowers often. But I'll admit that's not ever going to be the main sell. Ultimately, the main flaw with Monaka will always be that narrative value does not equate to popularity or sales, and Monaka is from a property that is not insanely popular. The only argument for her relies on the idea that Anniversary would be structured around Nasu's own fulfillment, rather than the audience, which is unlikely. However, I still think she's a good fit. Coming in at number 7 is Altera. I'm sure this is another confusing one on the surface, as Altera is neither a popular character, consistently relevant within FGO, nor does she really seem like she has significance to an upcoming chapter on the surface. But that's where you'd be wrong. Altera is not just a heroic spirit, she's the dream of Safar, the White Titan. Notably, Safar is one of the Void Cell probes within Fate/Extella, and the only one we know the identity of. However, the key thing of note is that Altera in fact debuted within Grand Order. None of that necessarily explains her role within FGO. There's actually been tons of hints toward the final conflict of FGO being about Void Cells. One of the things that's tied to Void Cells directly is that giant white titan that drains the planet of its textures, but Extella is not the only place we've heard about that. It's actually something brought up within the Lost Belts, namely Olympus and Avalon Lefay. Within Olympus, Safar's invasion 14,000 years ago was stopped by the Olympian machine gods, who are noted as being similar to Void Cells. The structures within Atlantis also clearly used Void Cell technology, which is implied to be the reason for its advancement. However, Safar is also acknowledged within Avalon Le-Fay. When the six fairies neglected to create the sacred sword, Excalibur, the world had no defense against Safar, and thus was wiped out, leaving it a blank surface. This led to a new genesis of sorts, where the body of Cernunnos became the land itself, leading to the primary conflict of Avalon Le-Fay. But these aren't the only times that void cells have been brought up. They're acknowledged within Fiyuki by Levin directly. They're compared to outer gods within Salem. The Valkyries in Lost Belt 2 are made from void cell technology. And even in Lost Belt 3, the concept of protecting from invasion from space is brought up constantly. Void cells are a threat that come once every 14,000 years, which are acknowledged with Fate Extella as arriving in 2030, but late, because the moon cell was hiding the Earth's location. This means that Grand Order, which is set within 2017, but due to time being frozen could end in 2025, a very close lineup to when void cells are meant to invade. It's also worth acknowledging that void cells are constantly brought up within recent chapters, namely Ordeal Call 3, which even directly calls out that they aren't important yet. However, the real threat of void cells is something that we didn't truly understand until Ordeal Call 3, where we saw the moon cancer. This is the collective desire of humanity to prevent the passing of the torch from humanity to a successor species, which takes the form of a white giant that strips the textures of the world. Sound familiar? But this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. In Tsukimi, a piece of blue glass moon, we see the introduction of something known as luminaries, a similar white giant form of archetype Earth, which bleaches the textures of the world. This is not something that I can possibly consider a coincidence, especially with it being brought up again within Ordeal Call 3. With the timeline adding up almost exactly, void cells seem like an inevitability, which makes Altera a very fitting anniversary candidate. However, Altera is not a popular character, nor is she needed to be anniversary in order to set up void cells. In addition, there's nothing to imply she'd have a particularly special kit. This makes her seem unlikely as the anniversary servant, even if her eventual appearance seems inevitable. Coming in at number 6 is Scion, or Dust of Osiris. Now, this isn't a particularly crazy pick, given how there's been constant hints at a conflict with Scion. She's a character from Melty Blood, a spin-off franchise which follows her, but notably she is not present within the recent remake. However, the most damning thing is Scion's appearance within Tunguska Sanctuary, which prompted a quote from Nasu about how the line was referring to the ideals she would always hold when she died. This is in reference to Scion's form within Melty Blood, Dust of Osiris. Notably, this form appeared within Ordeal Call 1, where it was the form of Ranni. This opens up an interesting possibility, hence this pick being Dust of Osiris more than Scion. The option of a servant with a different character per ascent. This isn't unfathomable, notably Ace, the Anniversary 8 servant, was both Ace and Summer Morgan, so this is a concept that is possible. This opens the door to interesting kit options, which would have to match both Scion and Ranni, or an interesting mechanic where the different ascends actively give different kits, although that may be a bit too much. Dust of Osiris is almost certainly relevant to future content, as there's been hints toward a villain role for Scion, and within Ordeal Call 1 she even says she has a role within Finale, which only she can play and cannot be Rizuka's friend for, implying some kind of friction between them. This likely is in regards to how Scion does not view simulated worlds as real worlds, despite Rizuka's framing within Lost Will of them being the same. This could potentially lead to conflict in regards to how they confront the final conflict, called Deus, an explicitly simulated world. There may be more to it too, as Dust of Osiris reveals within Melty Blood that when the planet is destroyed, the texture is swapped automatically with the real world. This could be the explanation for how the bleaching of the Earth occurred, and it may be information that only Scion could give, unless we get a proper Aprilia-focused chapter, which does explain the exact mechanics in extensive detail, due to it being the origin of displacement magic. Overall, Scion is a character whose clear relevance can make for an interesting kit and will perform incredibly well. This makes her a pretty good candidate for Anniversary. Coming in at number 5, we have Camazotz, or at least I thought so at first. Camazotz is the most requested character in the game. They're an NPC from Lost Belt 7 who is Beast 1 within the Lost Belt, whose design is beloved and has been acknowledged directly by Nasu as someone who could be summoned by Chaldea, but who he just wanted to let rest instead. It goes without saying why Camazotz makes sense as a candidate, and they perform incredibly well as an anniversary servant. They even have an existing kit, making them a pretty easy phoned-in pick. Camazotz could play a lot of angles within the upcoming story, such as fulfilling the implied absent seat of Beast 1, giving us more lore about Lost Belt 7, having a dynamic with Daebit who is implied to return, but most likely, they're an incredible foil for Ritsuka. Like I talked about with Monaka, there's clear room for Ritsuka to explore a darker option, such as within Ordeal Call 2, but Camazotz actually already did that. Camazotz is a human who functionally is the representative of humanity within their Lost Belt, the last human left standing, thus making them what they are. This is a dynamic that clearly parallels Ritsuka, and this is even directly acknowledged within Lost Belt 7, where Camazotz wants to have Ritsuka's role. However, an interesting angle that might come as a surprise is actually about how well Camazotz can set up Ritsuka becoming a beast, given his logos. Now, I know that idea might seem odd, but there's actually a lot in favor of it. Something has been noted from the beginning of the game is that beasts require the assistance of a grand servant to defeat, but we actually have seen Ritsuka do this without. Within Seraph, she defeats Kiara without a grand, and within Oku she defeats Kama without one either. This leaves two options open. Ritsuka either possesses the ability to defeat beasts inherently somehow, or beasts themselves can function as a grand within that circumstance, and defeat another beast, such as Kiara aiding in defeating Kama. Both of these leave that clear question of why Ritsuka can do it. In addition to this, Ritsuka has been noted consistently as being someone who loves and trusts unconditionally, yet is capable of monstrous harm, like destroying the Lost Belts. This is something that directly aligns with beasts, whose core tenet is that they destroy humanity out of love for it. There's also the matter of beasts becoming a playable class within the FGO arcade event, which directly contradicts the rules for how the class structure works, is directly blamed on Ritsuka. Hell, within that event, Neurodraco directly acknowledges that by contracting a beast, Ritsuka becomes functionally a beast. But the reason I bring up this is because Camazotz actually has really interesting logos, directly tied to their role as the last human, all of which absolutely apply to Ritsuka. Those logos are Salvation, Sacrifice, Exoneration, and Pity. Now, as unfortunate as it may be, there has been constant hints that Ritsuka will die in finale for years. Hell, within Ordeal Call 2, they directly acknowledge it, saying her journey will end in Antarctica, and Ritsuka on a separate occasion in that chapter saying that she cannot die yet. Likewise, Ritsuka has constantly been framed as part of a trio consisting of Roman and Kersaria, the two people who inspired her most, as directly acknowledged within Ordeal Call 3. Both of these people sacrificed themselves. This creates an awfully interesting picture where those logos of salvation, sacrifice, exoneration, and pity all actively apply to Ritsuka's potential role within finale, likely in regards to her forcing the world to remember the Lost Belt somehow, as Ordeal Call 4 acknowledged that they will currently be forgotten at the end, thus making the journey pointless. That said, Camazotz does fall short in one particular angle, and that is actual significance. What I have talked about almost exclusively is what Camazotz does for Ritsuka's character, and how they're well requested. But the truth is that Camazotz appeared in one chapter. In addition, if Ritsuka does become Beast 1, which seems to be possible given how the logos line up, then Camazotz becomes directly contradictory to that. On their own, they are not full circle whatsoever, they are requested. This is why Camazotz is not actually my number 5 pick. Instead, it's someone who does everything I think they can do, and more. Angra Mainyu. For starters, Angra Mainyu is one of the most full circle characters possible. They're the reason the Grail in Fate Stay Night is corrupted. Their arc in Hall Ataraxia clearly mirrors where FGO is heading, and they even say in Kirei's Valentine that anything they could talk about would be spoilers. This is corroborated by Angra Mainyu implying in his interlude years ago that Mash would wield Excalibur. which she now does. In addition, the setting of Finale, or at least a chapter tied to it, is likely Fuyuki, as Singularity F is acknowledged within Angermainu's interlude as being unresolved, and it was shown within the trailer for the back half of Arc 2. Yet we have not gone back. Angermainu is the most logical character to be involved within that chapter. Angermainu also will perform incredibly well, as they have multiple very popular appearances they could take, ranging from the design we have to Shiro Emiya, to even Dark Sakura. They also have tons of fascinating options for their kit, due to their gimmick of being the weakest servant. This at first seems like a detriment, but it could lead to interesting mechanics like debuff absorption, counter damage, and more. Overall, Angermainu and Camazotz both fulfill a role that I do think is important, but I do not think that Camazotz actually has the setting necessary to fulfill it. As such, I think Angermainu is a far better pick, given their hints at Finale involvement have only gotten louder and louder over time, especially during the Ordeal Call. They parallel Ritsuka in the same ways, they challenge her more, and they're more recognizable. That's why they beat Camazotz. Right. Now, number 4 is complicated, because I'm actually going to combine it with number 3. Coming in at these spots is Olga Marie Animasphere and Ritsuka Fujimaru. This is likely a bit of a surprise. I'm sure these characters who seem like they'd be number 1, let alone be addressed individually, but I actually think the argument for both of these characters is identical. Both of these characters have been relevant from the beginning of the game, one being the protagonist and the other being our functional main threat. They start out with an established relationship and have continued to have an established connection as shown with Ritsuka's desire to save Olga Marie, especially after Lost Vault 7. These characters also have a lot in common, particularly in regards to their roles within the Grand Order. The Grand Order is a stage prepared by Marasburu Animasphere that is meant to protect the future of proper human history by destroying it. They are the architect of the bleaching of the earth, the one responsible for Solomon being summoned and likely Goetia in extension, and the breath behind every notable character. Roman was their servant, Kershtaria their heir, Olga his daughter, David his killer, and Ritsuka is the culmination of all of that, the random girl who puts an end to the plan. Yet, she's shaped by everyone Marasburu touched. Mash, Roman, Da Vinci, Kershtaria, and of course, Olga. While they're framed as the villain, it's clear what's been designed as a closed system that demands Ritsuka and Olga fulfill their roles, as established within Olga Quest II. Both of these characters are the core of the finale, and likely every remaining chapter that might come before or after it. But what about them being servants? Olga we know has a kit from Lost Vault 7, even if it's rather outdated, but Ritsuka's not a servant, right? But that might not be true, because in Ordeal Call 4 we're told about Mash's condition after Arc 1, where she becomes a servant despite living. This leads to a functional loop of sorts, a servant who only exists within the time of their legend, so they can only be summoned within that time frame. With Mash, this was the incineration of humanity, but for Ritsuka? Well, where did she perform feats that the world would remember, especially if she ends up finding a way to force the world to remember Lost Vaults? Remember those logos? Salvation, oblivion, exoneration, and pity. Those are the blueprints for her ending. A girl who sacrifices herself for the world she destroyed to be remembered, becomes a hero by doing so, but only within the time of her legend. This makes Ritsuka being a servant for Anniversary one of the most potent picks possible, because it is the culmination of her entire character. And Olga follows similar logic. She's the main antagonist, the final threat, the one who will likely continue on after Ritsuka, given how she's made her entire goal to save Olga. That's why I cannot separate them, because I don't think these characters are meant to be. They could even work as a duo servant in all honesty. There's a lot of interesting options for a kit for Ritsuka, while speculating about Olga's is less important as we've already seen at least an option for hers. But one thing Ritsuka in particular could have as part of her kit is class score. This is a mechanic that is both very expensive, very important, and currently very useless. It only activates from the usage of a command spell, is a single turn buff, and only has value if the command spell is specifically used to trigger a Noble Phantasm. This has been somewhat addressed with the Grand class score, But those being valuable does not change the fact that all class score currently provides is buffs to that, or a single turn of power linked to a command spell, which you only get 3 per day. Ritsuka's kit as a servant could address this, making class score tied to a unit, rather than just command spells, giving it much more utility. However, the greatest issue that both Ritsuka and Olga face is their role within the narrative, particularly how having them as Anniversary Servant may be harmful to the player's experience. As I've established, I expect that if Ritsuka is a servant, then they will be a beast class, given the Logos lineup of Camisets. The same is obviously true of Olga, whom we've literally seen as a beast, even if her affinity is Shielder. The issue is that these are very major spoilers to new players, or in Ritsuka's case just outright spoilers for Finale. It doesn't matter if her becoming a beast is theoretically predictable, it still is something that could impact the experience of Finale negatively to know beforehand. This isn't necessarily just about the class. The design, for instance, could be a major drawback, as that moment likely should have a ton of narrative weight. However, the biggest issue is with new players if these characters were Anniversary Servant. New players do not know about Ritsuka's character, conclusion, or even what the beast class is when they have just started the game. Ultimately, it's not the end of the world to have Ritsuka becoming a servant spoiled, but what might be an issue is Olga. A little bit of a fun fact is that Olga being acknowledged is one of the only things that does not happen in any events that are not story locked. It is something that seemingly they have tried to keep from being spoiled most of the time, and making her a banner directly contradicts that. I mean, imagine watching her die in Fuyuki, only to open the summoning screen and see her on a banner as a beast class servant with the Yu Olga Marie design. That might be too far. However, it's worth acknowledging that there is a craft essence within the Rare Prism shop with Yu Olga Marie on it, which is accessible to new players. This is a minor thing, but it could imply that they are not as worried about hiding that reveal as it might seem at first. Regardless, both of these units, while being seemingly perfect fits, are still high risks. Also, they could be a duo servant, they could be a Hibiki situation. Coming in at number 2 is Goetia. This is one of the most obvious picks possible, and I don't intend to waste anyone's time with it. Goetia is the antagonist of Arc 1, who is directly responsible for a lot of Ritsuka's development. Within Lostwell, the line she references as her major motivation is the thing she says to Goetia, which directly is responsible for Goetia losing to her. Goetia also is functionally a very perfect mirror for Ritsuka, who is the original Beast 1, and thus makes a lot of sense if there is any intention of Ritsuka inheriting that title. However, it is impossible to acknowledge Goetia without bringing up Solomon. I'm sure most people's first guess would be that Solomon is Anniversary, and I think that is logical. However, Solomon currently is not in the Throne of Heroes. It's not a huge spoiler to have them available, as Anniversary Servants are always a unit that show up in a future chapter, but it has a major issue with one derivative option of Solomon. That is the Chaldean. This is a character who wears the appearance of Roman, who we don't know the true identity of. It's likely that they are Solomon or Goetia or Roman in some form, but ultimately it's a mystery still left entirely open. The issue is to do the Chaldean as Anniversary, that falls into the same risk as Olga. Ultimately, they might not care, or at least less so given Roman isn't as big of a spoiler, but it's still a risk. However, the biggest risk I would outline with doing the Chaldean as part of Solomon would be that it is actively harmful to Ritsuka's character. Ritsuka as a character has struggled with accepting people dying. That is a very consistent trait, and it's acknowledged in things like Lostwell, or especially Ordeal Call 2. But the main culprit of this is Roman, as she has clearly not found closure with their death. She's acknowledged this to some capacity given how she treats the Chaldean, but Ritsuka's arc is clearly not building to getting Roman back, it's building to moving on from them. Like Roman, her arc is clearly about sacrificing herself and entrusting the future to others, likely Mash or Olga. But if Roman is still in the picture as Roman, then it harms that decision. Ritsuka, as established within Ordeal Call 3, needs to face that Roman is gone. It's something directly acknowledged within the Temple of Time. that Roman would die and Ritsuka struggled to face it there. But the Chaldean currently is a very big risk, because if they simply become Roman again, then it undermines the sacrifice in the end of Arc 1, which clearly is the blueprint for Ritsuka's sacrifice. That does not make Solomon impossible, nor does it make Goetia unlikely. I'd still say they are by far one of the most likely candidates, even if the most predictable one. I would just emphasize that Solomon being Anniversary only really works if they are there as Solomon or Goetia. I do not think it works if they are there as Roman. However, it's worth acknowledging that Anniversary servants have a habit of being unpredictable. When Anniversary came around last year, one of the most popular theories by far was CL, and that was deemed too obvious by Nasu. So, she was the Summer Servant instead, and Ereshkigal, a commonly suspected Summer Servant, was the Anniversary Servant, as a Beast class, something very unpredictable. It might be a minor point, but Solomon and Goetia are the most predictable Anniversary Servants possible by such a large margin, and if this year proves anything to be like last year, I don't think the Anniversary Servant will be the most predictable one. If anything, I think given the timing, Solomon is likely to be New Year's 2026, as they'll likely be reinstated in the throne in the finale by Ritsuka's wish. But that leaves the question, who is number 1? Coming in at number 1 is Artoria Pendragon. This is probably the most unexpected pick I could possibly choose to be the most likely. Ultimately, I have been haunted by last year's Anniversary Servant, and I cannot accept that Nasu would use the most predictable one. Ultimately, I think that Anniversary is going to be the biggest surprise possible, while being the most obvious pick for Fate itself, and that is Artoria. There's a lot of angles to this pick, but the easiest place to start is going to be marketing. It goes without saying, but Artoria will almost certainly eclipse Ereshkigal when it comes to her performance on Banner. She is not just a well-liked character, she is the face of Fate itself. She's even the icon of Grand Order, where she hasn't even appeared in that form. However, the biggest boost to marketing, which has far too coincidental timing for me to ignore, is about the Honkai Star Rail collab with Fate, which began on July 11th and had Artoria as one of the units available. Now, I understand that a crossover is not necessarily a sign of the character themselves being in Grand Order, but what would be an interview quote where Nasu directly acknowledges a post-FGO version of Artoria as a separate character, despite her not appearing in the game yet. Artoria has been within FGO for years, but she has not been relevant. Her kit is atrocious, her interludes have zero lore, nor has she gotten any in years, nor do they contain any specific development. Every single time that FGO has done something with Artoria, it is never Saber. It's Castoria, or Morgan, or Ace, but never Saber. That implies something when Nasu says there's a post-FGO version of Artoria. So, we're going to zoom out. Honkai Star Rail is a game that is incredibly popular, that while having a lot of audience overlap, also does not have a lot of audience overlap. The point is, it is a very good audience for Fate to target if it wanted new players, which the current Fate collab absolutely will do. The timing of that is almost certainly tied to the release of Fate Hall at Araxia sometime this year, but the reality is that the players for another gacha game are likely going to try the other gacha game once introduced to Fate, especially when the creator of Honkai Star Rail talks about FGO, and Nasu talks about the recent FGO chapter randomly in their interview unprompted. There is quite literally nothing that is better marketing for FGO to that audience, let alone just new players in general, than to have the Anniversary Servant be Saber. Because what that does is it creates a loop. People get attached to Saber in Honkai Star Rail's collaboration event, they hear she's the Anniversary Servant in FGO, they play FGO, because they are already attached to the character who is on Banner. This also is just an incredible move from a universal standpoint, because Artori is the most recognizable character in all of Fate, so nothing will attract more attention to FGO than to give her a new form. There's also some rather beneficial things with Honkai Star Rail's collaboration, assuming that Saber is the Anniversary Servant. For starters, the event story almost exclusively centers her. While other characters are present, the emotional development is entirely focused on Saber, specifically her conclusion after Fate/Stay Night. This is incredible for marketing regardless, as we have actively seen her make the decision to pull the sword from the stone again in that event, which Fate/Stay Night left us with only the promise she might. But Saber is also the most beginner-friendly character within Honkai Star Rail. This is not abnormal by any means, as she is a collaboration character who they want to perform well, but it has a potentially convenient side effect of getting more people interested in her character. People who then could be brought over to Grand Order if she were the Anniversary Servant, because they're already attached to Saber. Now, within the realm of FGO, it is worth acknowledging that Saber has been freely available from the 5-star starting ticket for about 4 years. It was even given for free directly during the Fate Stay Night campaign last year. This is not a decision that is illogical, but it does actively discourage people from pulling for the character who is the most popular to new players. However, this doesn't particularly matter, because Artoria's kit is absolutely terrible. Like most Sabers in the game, Artoria is very unusable, which is illogical given her being the most marketable character. Ultimately, it's always been logical to make her part of the story, and Finale makes sense as the setting, especially given our potential buildup with Ace as an Anniversary Servant, for instance, who has not shown up yet in the main story. But if she's going to show up, then how much better does she perform as Anniversary compared to as a Finale banner? Or alternatively, how much do they want the Finale banners to be FGO characters, rather than the face of Fate itself? There's also a very interesting thread that has been left open with the Grand quests. When we first got the announcement of them, the assumption was that they would not be that important, which was corroborated by a message during the Grand Saber reveal that it was only chosen for the quest, not story. However, we have since not gotten that message within the other reveals, and our most recent Grand, Indra, literally had an event to prelude them being the Grand Lancer. This does leave plenty of room for speculation that it is specifically Grand Saber that is story relevant, as the slot is not filled currently and the quest needed a stand-in. There are two real components to what I think Artoria's role within the finale is. Obviously, given the potential setting of Fuyuki, Artoria already has an incredibly easy argument for where she shows up, when, and why. However, the thing I would actually point toward is specifically the detail that the weapon against Void Cells is Excalibur. Now, I'm sure the thought has maybe crossed someone's mind that Mash is likely the defense against Void Cells, given her now wielding Excalibur, but Mash suffers from a critical flaw in that role. Excalibur is meant to represent the unity of humanity and the planet, but this is a conflict that Mash has never had. Her arc has been about learning to be human, but the concept of that unity has never once even been hinted at. There's far better arguments for someone like Ritsuka wielding Excalibur against Void Cells, that she has actively had that conflict about humanity and the planet's alignment, wherein Mash has exclusively been a spectator to that. However, Artoria's conflict is actively about that. In fact, the conflict that Kostoria faced was literally that. Artoria also has consistently been framed as the humanity side of Camelot, wherein Morgan is actively acknowledged as being a candidate for Archetype Earth. Given how Ace has not shown up in the main story, it is not at all unlikely that the thing left for Artoria to face is that conflict with Morgan, which has been hinted repeatedly throughout the story, especially within Avalon LeFay. That is what I believe the story has been building to, and why I think Artoria is the best Anniversary Servant possible. She is the face of Fate, who is the character that Nasu has always been the most protective of. We've had built into her having an arc, and we have the pieces in place. We're missing a Grand Saber, there's a Morgan dynamic in place, she foils Ritsuka's conflict perfectly, all that's left for us is to see it. Or, Nasu will somehow outdo me trying to predict him outdoing me, and I will lose my mind again and try again next year. I'm gonna hope it's not that one. Thank you for watching. like and subscribe.